Just a reminder to the speakers, I should have said this earlier, before your speech, let us know how you prefer to take POIs as well. So thank you very much to the previous speaker, and we welcome the leader of opposition.
Hello. POIs in the chat is fine. All right, I'm going to start, assuming I'm audible and whatnot, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. Firstly, characterize what we think selflessness actually looks like. Secondly, explain why it is necessary in relationships. Then compare it to what the alternative is, which we think opening government doesn't actually characterize reasonably, which is what we think will end up being a very transactional relationship that actually has a number of problems. And then I'm going to look at how this applies in a number of specific contexts, specifically for women, and also in a child rearing context, which we think is crucially important in this debate. Let's look at what selflessness actually is. We think it is accepting that things are not always going to be 50-50 in a relationship. It is obviously putting others' needs in the majority of instances above your own. But what isn't it? It is not putting up with unreasonable burdens. It is not making unreasonable sacrifices. It is not copying abuse. And increasingly, we will note that the trend that exists in the status quo is things like saying, I need to do some things for myself. I need to look after myself for this particular day in order to be the best partner or the best mother, and so on. So there is scope within existing frameworks to take time for yourself, and it is not unreasonable things like the government bench might contend. And I think this undercuts a lot of the worst harms that government bench has discussed and is likely to discuss in the context of this debate. So I think that is important to clarify from the get-go. Let's secondly explain why we need selflessness, why this ought to be prioritized, and why this needs to be a core part of the narratives and the framework by which we understand relationships. 4 reasons for this. Firstly, I would just make an observation that so much of our reality is based around a currency system, the way in which we work, the way in which we sort of exchange ideas with people in, a consumerist framework. Relationships and our human interactions are one of the few things that we don't see as part of this currency system. So just an observation, we think in and of itself, it would be a shame to have more of the world operate under the same framework. We think a plurality of frameworks that operate means we have more diversity to construct ourselves and our identity, and that is a good thing. Secondly, though, we will just observe that there are so many structures in life that make life hard. Capitalism, work, racism, sexism, all the things that we have to struggle through. Relationships, therefore, in the majority of instances, act as a necessary support structure to overcome many of those ills. And notably, those support structures are often tailored because we know the people that we are in relationships with, we know what they want, and we can support them in a way that is useful. So that is necessary in that instance. Thirdly, I would also observe that it is difficult to often conceptualize the benefit of acting selflessly, and that is why you need a narrative that prioritizes it, because those benefits are not intuitive. So how can those benefits often operate? The first is that you might do something for a while that is selfless for another person, and maybe you don't see that benefit in the first instance because they're going through a difficult time and they're not in a position to give back to you at present. But that does pay off 5 years down the track, where that person remembers the thing that you did for them, and then they come through at a point in time for you where you need it the most. But it is difficult to actualize that and recognize that at that point in time if you do not operate in the framework that we suggest. But even if they do not come through for you at a point in the future, that is still good. You feel like you've helped someone else, and you feel a sense of pride because of that. But again, you need the narrative that exists in order to actualize that thing, because those things are not intuitive. The final observation, though, I would make under this point is just to suggest that this framework operating in a relationships context also broadens and applies to other things. So when we operate under a system of selflessness in our relationships, it means we can more intuitively apply it to other things like giving back to charity, and that makes for a better society. I would note that all of this material is more important than anything else anyone is going to say in the debate, because worst case, government can prove that relationships are a little bit unequal, but that does not matter if we get an on-net better society that helps people, that supports people in the darkest of times when they need that support the most, when they're going through truly horrific things. So that is the most important thing in this debate. Does closing have a POI before I continue? Yep.
Yeah, so people who you are describing are also likely to be good on our side of the house. If they have such a good moral compass, they will respect your boundaries and you will find the compromise 50-50. What is the difference on your side, and why people on average have good intentions to being in a relationship in such a horrific structures?
No. See, your case kind of really simplifies the status quo. This is not a debate about good people and bad people. It's about people on the margins who are probably not bad people, but they do not feel the overwhelming need to sacrifice in times where it would be difficult for them. This is where this narrative is important and applies. Now let's look at the transactional nature of relationships and why this is bad, because that is actually the alternative that we're likely to get in their world. 4 reasons for this. Firstly, because it's more likely to operate in a system where the person with the most power is able to demand, things from that relationship. And obviously that exists in both contexts, i.e. if you have a framework of selflessness, you can demand more there. But I think in the framework of selflessness, you may feel guilty maybe at most because you can't, offer that thing. But I think in this context, it's far, far, far worse because, you probably have something to offer in a transactional system. So when you aren't able to offer that, you feel all the more guilty. But secondly, I would note that there's just so much unpredictability in life, right? And you find it difficult to conceptualize this. If you operate under a system of selfishness, like the very first instance, someone cannot offer you something in return, you're likely to drop that relationship when in the long term, that might be something that is highly beneficial for you. We think it's better that people stick things out. The third observation I would make is that obviously in a transactional system, there are just some people who cannot be a part of that system. If you are someone who does not have money or you suffer from mental illness, or for example, you just, do not have as much on a surface level I'm not saying that these people cannot offer good things, right? But the problem is that in this system, it'll be conceptualized that they cannot do those things, right? And that just means so many people lose out from relationships. And lastly, I would just observe that at the point where you do nice things, it'll feel insincere and kind of cheap as a result. Let's quickly talk about women now. I think that there are yes, opening government are right to point out that this norm operates has operated badly with respect to women, i.e. women being more socialized to do selfless things. But those norms are changing, i.e. men are now increasingly more expected to do housework, and we would rather see that continue. The other thing to observe though is men are often more socialized into selfishness. Therefore, they're probably more equipped to co-opt it and use it in their system, which would probably be more of a disadvantage to women. Finally, I would just note with respect to children, they are a vulnerable group. They are in need of protection. We think it would be bad to have a world where selfishness is prioritized, where parents do things like, for example, force them down a path of, I want you to live up to my legacy because you have to give something back to me in order, as an equivalent to the fact that I raised you. We think that would be a regrettable system as well. And for all of those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
So let me just start some things. Okay. Points of information in the chat, please. I'm going to open it just to make sure I can see it. Let's recognize that the world we exist in already has a significant number of norms that promote selflessness. Jess herself in her speech points out that these norms exist when she says people feel happy when people do nice things for them or when they do nice things for others. That spark of happiness when you are selfless is something that does not change on either side. Most of these norms surrounding selflessness and the benefits they bring to people that Jess mentions just don't change on either side. The only change we're giving is the norm surrounding selflessness in relationships specifically. All other norms promoting good behavior, charitable donations, and whatnot still exist. I don't think people are going to become completely selfish with the worst excesses of human nature. People still want to make each other happy. Here's the real difference. We want the existence of a countervailing narrative that says relationships are about people operating independently together. We think that this is very important because of all the other existing norms that tell women that they need to make uneven sacrifices in order to ensure the happiness of men, norms that tell parents that they need to sacrifice endlessly to ensure the happiness of their adult children, even from broken families who are told they need to be endlessly selfless in order to ensure the happiness of parents who never did anything for them. We think that we change these norms for all the good scenarios that opening opposition mentions. Other norms exist. The second thing I want to clear up here is this idea of selflessness not including the worst excesses of being coerced to stay in relationships. I'm just going to point out that selflessness probably isn't selflessness unless there is a real sacrifice. So in many cases, when you are being selfless, you do sacrifice something. It doesn't have to be a very large sacrifice all the time, but very often it is a series of incremental small sacrifices that add up over time, erode your autonomy and erode your identity. So when all says they can block against the worst excesses of all of these things, I simply don't think that's true. 2 points for you today, rebuttal interwoven at the end. The first thing I want to talk to you about is why this erodes autonomy over time and it makes leaving relationships much harder. The second thing I want to talk to you about is how this is nested in a larger narrative of what happiness is. First of all, about leaving relationships and eroding autonomy. Srishti gave you many reasons to believe that the pressure to be selfless is inequitably distributed. She also gave you many reasons to believe that the ways in which selflessness manifests has a strong impact on your individual identity. She mentioned jobs, domestic labor, emotional labor, hobbies, friends, all of these things. Now, to extend this a little bit further, I want to point out that a relationship is an especially harmful space for selflessness, precisely because your partner or your family is in a privileged position relative to you, meaning they have an especial influence over you and therefore have a special ability to influence your interests and the rest of your identity. Having choices dictated by a partner's interest or by your family's interest necessarily changes oneself. Being told you are valued for what you can do for others also changes your own valuation of yourself and your worth. What you find particularly valuable about yourself now is not the way you are able to carry out various hobbies of your own, not the way you are able to present confidently, but rather how much you are able to show that you are a selfless partner or a caring child. The narrative here is one that says your interests are always less important and less prioritized because, as Srishti has pointed out, selflessness is inequitably distributed and has a strong impact on identity. What does this then lead to? It leads to an erosion of autonomy over time, because over time, as people dictate your interests, you find that you have less and less time to pursue your own dreams, your own aspirations, your own ambitions. And very often, these are dreams and aspirations that are time locked, where the opportunities are limited. Over time, you lose support networks outside of your relationships. You lose, for instance, your hobbies, or you lose things that give you a sense of self-worth, because you are always called upon to make those small sacrifices over time, incrementally, in order to make your relationship work. This means at the point of your relationship ending, you are faced with a much more horrifying prospect than just the end of a relationship. You are now losing an identity that you have built around your relationship. This kind of fear of the unknown, the fear of who you will be without the selflessness, the fear of who you will be without a relationship to cater to, is something that does trap people within relationships and loses them the support networks that opening opposition would like to talk about. The last thing I will say here is that it's much easier to leave a relationship when you are told that your self-interest is okay to prioritize. You are more likely to stay in a relationship in a world where you are told you should sacrifice your self-interest because look how happy he is with you. You should sacrifice your self-interest and stay in this relationship because he will be devastated if you leave. All of these kinds of narratives traps people in relationships they don't necessarily want to be in and prevents them from escaping the worst kinds of relationships that opening opposition is worried about. The second thing I want to talk about it's a larger narrative of happiness that this is nested in. Selflessness and self-sacrifice is nested in a narrative that says you are wholly or partially responsible for ensuring the happiness of others. This is bad for a number of reasons. First of all, because the happiness of others is out of your control. You are told that by being selfless, by prioritizing others' interests above your own, you are able to make them happier, even if only for a short while. This leads you to feel a sense of frequent helplessness, because very often that narrative of self-sacrifice doesn't lead to the kinds of outcomes you want. But second of all, it teaches people to externalize responsibility for their own happiness to their partner or their family. It teaches them that they should expect other people to sacrifice their interests for them. Because again, as Srishti has characterized for you, a lot of this burden isn't equitably distributed. This means that on our world, we have more instances where the norm of selfishness equips people with the autonomy and the self-confidence and the willingness and ability to say no when it gets too much, to say that you are responsible for your own happiness and I am not responsible for everything that you do or you choose to do with your life. And we think that's very important as well, because it allows people greater independence and also allows them to leave relationships more easily. Very quickly, a couple of responses that didn't fit in there. Opening opposition talks about transactional relationships. I would posit that actually is status quo, where you are essentially told the moment you don't sacrifice yourself, you are a bad partner who's not willing to make the sacrifices to make the relationship work. The second thing is that I think transactional relationships actually get less on our side because you are more equipped with the autonomy and the willingness to leave an unequal relationship. So the moment it gets too transactional for your liking, you are equipped to leave. The second thing they pointed out was children. I would say, yes, children should be protected, but I think a lot of norms that say you should probably protect your family do still exist. We are guarding you against the worst excesses of it that say parents should always stick together for the children, even if really they should be separated, or norms that say children should always take care of their older family members, even if their family members were terrible to them as a kid. I think in this case, we are the side that grants you greater autonomy and greater self-identity. Very, very proud to propose.
Thank you. We now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay, thank you. Can I just check that I am audible? Right, amazing. Wait, sorry, let me pull up a timer. I just had to join another Zoom meeting on my phone just now. Okay, come on, online stopwatch. There we go. Oh, okay. I guess everyone on Facebook knows that I'm on 2 Zoom meetings now. That's good. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the extent of capitalism and how much it permeates everything that we do is scary and terrifying. I go to work every day where I am demanded to give my best at all times. I have to also work at school where I'm demanded that I give my best at all times. And I think it is exhausting that when I get home and chat to my flatmates, I'm also expected to be giving it 100% my best. The thing that I don't understand about the opening government case is that they keep talking about how you can demand more, you can take time for yourself. But if no one is giving, then no one is taking either. And if both partners in a relationship are just constantly prioritizing themselves, then that's not a relationship anymore. 2 things that I'm going to be talking about. Firstly, about relationship capitalism and about the transactional nature of relationships and how that makes it terrible. And second, about the inability to form long-term relationships that are healthy, that are meaningful in a world where this is the norm rather than selflessness. Before that, I just have one brief observation about the opening government case and why I genuinely do think that a lot of it doesn't apply. And I think that is that the narrative that they try to push forward is one where it's more transactional, because you're better able to demand things like time for yourself or self-care, but also less transactional in some ways, even though it makes it explicitly transactional. The other thing that I want to point out is that, again, they need to explain and they need to accept that in order for someone to be able to basically take things from a relationship, the other person has to give them up. Transactions are zero sum, right? In order for me to be taking time off, that means that the other person is also losing out on something that's valuable to them, like talking to me or my friendship. If I pay for dinner, that means that I am actively losing something in that transaction as well. So I think that they need to accept that it's impossible for both partners to completely be prioritizing themselves at all times, and there needs to be a sacrifice. I think that becomes important in a second. So let's start off in relationship capitalism. And why does the transactional nature of capitalism sort of ruin everything? I want to first deal with what opening government tells us here in terms of the status quo and how in the status quo we already expect selfishness of women, and therefore now they're better able to negotiate themselves out of it. I want to point this out because I think that what they do is make it worse. I think that this doesn't change at all. It just makes it easier for men to demand labor for women now that relationships are explicitly transactional. There's two reasons why this happens. Firstly is because women's labor is already seen as lesser, or gender minority labor is already seen as lesser. Things like doing housework or taking care of the children are not even seen as work in most places. But also things like emotional labor, men don't understand it and don't comprehend that it's actually exhausting in many ways. So what the man will see is, I paid for dinner and I brought dinner home to our home and I gave you this incredible house that you and your children can live in. What have you done all day? You have done nothing. You need to contribute more. You need to please me. You need to think of my needs and prioritize them. I think that the second thing that it does is also that men have very skewed perceptions of what women do. This is why, for example, if you have a conversation that's split even 50-50, what ends up happening is that men think that women are dominating the conversation. And when they speak only 30%, they think that they are the ones that are, participating equally. So I think that given those two things, relationships are still going to be heavily skewed towards men. But the only thing that changes is that now they have a lot more power to demand more things, because now relationships are explicitly transactional. If they think this is a problem, they make it 10 times worse. And I think that that's something that's really, really horrifying. The last thing that I want to point out that, Jess already tells you why in the status quo, that doesn't happen because men have less power to coerce you into doing things precisely because of the nature of relationships. But importantly, I think that Jess also tells you that there's already existing frameworks via which you can prioritize yourself and take self-care out. Things like saying, in order to be a better friend, I need to take time off for myself. But also, I think you can also play that card against the other person in a way, right? Because you can say, look, you need to understand that I need to prioritize myself at the moment, and you will understand that even if it makes you sad, because you are my friend and you want what is best for me. So I think that there's already existing frameworks that allow you to do that. The second thing that I want to take out on that I don't talk about in this clash is about acceptance. And I think that this is really, really, really quite important, right? Because look, Enting says that we have to deal with the worst of the worst. I think that Jess already gave you reasons as to why it is that we can mitigate those harms, but more importantly, that means that they do as well, right? They can't live in sort of like self-care world where we can take time off for ourselves and our careers. They also need to deal with the fact that acceptance is oftentimes only there because of selflessness. The only reason why parents in a really homophobic environment would accept like an LGBT kid, for example, is partly because they love them, but partly because they accept that relationships need to be selfless. If they think that it's selfish, if they think that this kid has betrayed you, has betrayed your family and your legacy, and also it will give you no benefit to keep liking this kid or being or loving it, because all of your friends are going to think that your family is horrible, then that disappears. Things like marrying outside of your class or your race are there also because of selflessness, because you know that you're marrying down if you marry someone who oftentimes is significantly less economically advantaged than you are, but you do it anyway because of love and because of selflessness, because relationships aren't transactions. And I think that disappears the second that you take selflessness out of the equation. Lastly, I just think that relationships lose meaning, right? Again, you lose the ability to relax in your environment when you think that everything is always being expected of you. When you think that relationships are transactional, you can't go home and relax because you're like, oh my God, I am grumpy. I am not being the best that I can be. These people won't want to be my friends anymore, which means that you're always constantly stressed. So relationships are no longer nice. The transactional nature of relationships fucks them over. Like, we live in a rock that's floating in space. Why does money and capitalism exist? Just like it doesn't need to be brought into relationships. I will take closing government really quick. Sharms.
Yeah. So in a world that you are talking about, why do you assume that men can demand any more than they currently do, as opposed to the thing that has the greatest possibility of change being the women's acceptance of what men demand from them?
Well, because I think that women are already socialized into taking more of men's shit than men are, right? But also because of the two things that I mentioned, that men tend to see women's labor as lesser, and also because they tend to think that women's like domination is unequal, right? So I think that given those two things, men are just going to be more comfortable demanding things, and women are more going to accept them, but it's just going to become more acceptable to do this. Lastly, why does it enable us to form healthy long-term relationships? And I think that Klaudia's POI here is pretty fair, right? Like, people are good, they're going to help their friends. But I think that the problem when it's transactional is that it's very difficult to predict how relationships are going to play out. You're essentially encouraging doing like Wall Street trading, but with friendships. It's like, is the risk that this person is going to become less depressed and be able to then give back all of the time that I spent listening to them bitch about their boyfriend? I don't know. Should I dump them? Maybe. Is the fact that this person moved away from me and therefore I no longer see them and dropped everything in this relationship gonna change anytime soon? Because if it doesn't, then I should drop them. I think that you lose the ability to form long-term relationships when you don't have selflessness. And I think that's something that's deeply regrettable. And for all those reasons, vote opening up.
Thank you. We now welcome the member of government.
Okay. Right. 3, 2, 1. I want to start off with a very simple claim about where exactly the narrative of selflessness comes from, in order to explain why I think a transactional economy of relationships is actually really good for people. The first claim that I'm going to make is that when we don't see relationships as selfish, we seem to assume and ascribe a larger than life value to justify the selflessness that we must give. So in this debate, I think opening just bandies about the idea of selflessness and throws it out there as though the norms created the notion of selflessness in the first place, and not about the idea that that particular narrative assumes that selflessness comes from somewhere. So where is that somewhere that we think selflessness comes from in the way that we currently justify in status quo? We tend to ascribe these larger than life values, something like filial piety, maternal love, romantic love, some sort of great irrational quality that justifies why we ought to be more selfless in the way that we act in our relationships, and why we ought to wash the slate clean and only act in accordance to our emotions, in accordance to a servitude or some greater ideal than what we otherwise would in a transactional economy. And if this sounds a little bit fluffy, I'm going to give a couple of analogs to this. I think the analog in our world as to how exactly relationships are going to be seen as transactional is that we think that it's very similar to, for example, having to find a job, but finding a job that you really kind of like. Because if you listen to the language of the OO, they seem to assume that, it's not a relationship because you're only ever interacting with someone in the hopes of getting something out of them. But presumably there was the initial choice about starting to get into the relationship in the first place, which probably stemmed from something like liking to hang out with that person, like kind of enjoying their presence and wanting to be in some kind of like association with them, which means that it is probably similar to something like, working for a company and still ultimately being beholden to working hours, but kind of liking my work and kind of liking my jobs, but not being willing to take shit from my boss if it means that you're not paying me overtime or making me work too hard for that matter. And I think this is really important because I think this transactional nature creates a significant change in the way that we conceptualize and construe relationships, in the sense that when we think of it as selfless, because we have to ascribe it to this larger than life ideal, we tend to be very irrational about the way that we conceptualize our partner's actions and very irrational about the way that we conceptualize our emotions within the relationship. But when it comes to transactionality, we are far more able to rationally pinpoint when people have done us wrong, when they have helped us, and when we have also committed wrongs, and when we have done good things as well. The problem is that when you are saying that something is due to love, is something that's due to affection, it's much harder for you to be able to pinpoint and to accurately and rationally determine that actually I was wrong in this instance, or maybe actually I've contributed less to this relationship, and that it is legitimate for my partner to expect me to give a little bit more. I think that's important because transactionality is, as OO points out, something we're incredibly used to, and it's just that frame that we want individuals to adopt when they're entering those relationships. Here's why I'll explain why it makes things better. The first thing is, and let's deal with OO. I think the issue here with OO, with regards to this men versus women argument, is the suggestion that for some reason, men now have a greater capacity to demand more from women. I would suggest that throughout history, men have demanded pretty a lot from women, right? It's probably very difficult to identify how much more they can ask from us. But I think the difference here is that you can't just assume staticity in terms of women being socialized and accepting more. It is the change in the relationship specifically that suggests that when women now no longer have to conceive of themselves as selfless, that they are less likely to value their contributions less, that they are less likely to take the shit that men give to them. And I think that is what the biggest change and the biggest potential for change in this debate is. Not that men will ask for less or ask for more, but rather whether or not women are willing to stay in those relationships when men is asking for more, when the men are asking for more, then they are willing to give up. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing that I want to bring in terms of extension is just talking about the minutiae of relationships and why we think on a probabilistical basis, we are more likely to result in more successful relationships that lead to long-term happiness for individuals. Because I think in terms of societal impacts, maybe OG has dealt with a lot of it. I'm just gonna try and claim, here that, in terms of framing, the relationships that we're talking about in terms of affecting everyone, is actually really important. And the reason for that is because what is a relationship? But the moments that make up the relationship and the amount of utility that you get from those relationships and the happiness that comes about from your association with other individuals, given that we are social creatures. So why is it a non-transactional view of relationships makes things significantly worse? I have 3 reasons. The first is capitalistic realities. The world that we live in is one in which you are actually quite sad. There's a coercive force that dictates you must divert your attention from whatever philosophical or lovely pursuits that you have in order to do preoccupations that are required for survival. Oftentimes, things like your job, things like the work you have to do, things like trying to craft a career for yourself, take up an inordinate amount of your time that takes it away from your capacity to be able to deal with relationships in the best possible way that you want to. This affects all relationships, including parental relationships, as well as romantic relationships, as well as friendships. The problem here, however, is that we tend to not conceive of these things as being important and impediments to relationships, because we want to believe that the love that we share is sufficient such that even after I'm tired from a day of work, I'm still willing to associate with you because I love you so much. I think in a world where we think of relationships as significantly more transactional, we are able to create a symmetry between these 2 pursuits and ensure that we are better able to understand when people are not being entirely invested. But we also means that we think on net, the lives of people are now less good because they spend more time worrying about what exactly they could be contributing more to in their relationship, as opposed to being able to apportion time the way that they would for any other obligations that they had towards their relationship and towards work. I think that makes relationships significantly more sustainable, and I think that's a good thing for people as a whole. But the second thing I want to talk about then is why we think that just people are biologically engineered towards not being very good in not being transactional relationships. And the reason for that is because of risk aversion and the extent to which we remember things like pain, much more so than we remember things like happiness. So at the point at which we are not forced to be numerical almost to a point about our relationship and to rationally conclude when people have helped us and when people have not. I think the problem is that human beings are geared and wired towards remembering pain a lot more vividly than they do happiness. That is why, for example, when individuals when individuals leave an unhappy relationship at the end of a really bad breakup, they tend to remember the relationship as a complete negative, even if the years preceding that particular relationship actually resulted in more net happiness than they otherwise would, which often results in things like, for example, people shying away from romantic relationships or shying away from similar forms of relationships for fear of getting hurt in the future. I think the problem here is that because you are thought of, or because you are forced to be selfless, the issue here is that within that relationship and while you are in that relationship, you tend to remember the hurt your partner has caused and weigh that subconsciously a lot more than anything that your partner has done for you. Again, I think that a more rational and currency-based conceptualization and weighing of these things is much better for the relationship in terms of identifying where you can contribute more and being just better at understanding when you can, how the relationship can function. I think these things might sound really bad in the beginning, but when you're 60, I don't really think you care about passion any longer. You just want someone who's willing to bear with your shit. I think it's the most sustainable way of getting there. We're happy to propose.
Thank you. We now welcome the member of opposition.
Okay, just quickly checking that I'm audible. Awesome. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. So what I like about narratives debates is how often it gets to describe both sides. So if we see what Top Hat did, we have an OG. Obviously, the narrative today is that everyone needs to give up on everything, especially women, on their work and their happiness and their complete identity. No, 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 says OO. Obviously, on your side, everyone thinks that their partner owes them the world and they need to give up on everything for them. We're going to add a bit of nuance here. So I'm going to make 2 main extensions in my speech. Firstly, on the balance, why we think that people have it extremely hard to be selfless, extremely hard to be empathetic, and we need to balance it off by actively making them think about it, because otherwise they would always err on the side of selfishness. Secondly, on the asymmetry between genders, why we think our narrative is likely to be better for breaking the asymmetry for women as opposed to their narrative. Just 2 points of extraneous rebuttal. Firstly, to CG, the gist of their case was basically, people will make relationships better because they have the incentive to make them better for, selfishness leading to mutual benefits for both. I'm going to deal with this more in my first point, but please note, the premise of this case, which was never proven, is that people are good in identifying when the trade-off is better for both. There's a prisoner's dilemma question here, right? Like often it would be the case that it would be preferable for both of us to compromise, but who is going to make the compromise first? This CG never proves. Secondly, on OG's idea of giving away your identity, I think the biggest issue there is we are never explained why your partners / children / friends aren't part of your identity. Please note, people making sacrifices for things they love is not a bad thing. I make a shit ton of sacrifices for my debating career. It's not taking away my identity. My debating career is part of my identity. As for many people, their significant others, their children, their family are part of their identity. It is fine to make sacrifices for them. It doesn't cancel out their identity. Let's get to the points. Firstly, let's talk on balance. Why do we think that their side would err too much on the side of selfishness? Note how hard it is to be selfless. Several reasons. Firstly, we know what we want. We are constantly inside our own heads. We don't know what the other side wants. We can interpret from their behaviors or what they say, sure, but we always feel more naturally our wishes and desires than we feel the other side. It also means that we know the extent of our wants better, right? We are always likely to feel like we are on the right side and we need it better because we feel very, very strongly, and the other side seems like meaningless to us. We don't understand why it's such a big deal to them because we don't understand them. We feel our needs, we don't feel theirs. Secondly, we know our circumstances best, right? It means that we are likelier to feel like we are justified. We usually think that if we have a problem in our life, it's due to bad luck, due to our circumstances. Whereas on other people, since we don't know their circumstances, the bad day they had, their upbringing, etc., if they have a problem, we tend to blame them and their personality more because we don't know the external factors leading to this, leading to also a justification of us being selfish, right? We think that we are on the just side being selfish all the time because we feel that we had a reason to and the other side is just being problematic. Thirdly, we think that people are accustomed and trained in prioritizing themselves from literally birth. We are born with our desires. We are born with instinctively wanting things. We need to actively learn to think of the other side and care for them. We don't know how to do this from. And lastly, just the path of least resistance. It's so easy to be selfish. I don't need to make sacrifices for this. I don't need to suffer. I'm likely to rationalize to myself why it means that being selfish is also the right thing to do. Why we think the narrative on our side solves and balances it out, right? We think people are likelier to ask and research and actually try and think what the other side goes through. If there's a narrative that tells them that they are supposed to be selfless, they're more likely to ask the other side, tell me your perspective, explain this to me, etc. Secondly, people are more likely to assume courtesy on the other side because they know that if there is an expectancy of selflessness in relationships, I am less likely to think that my partner / parent / whatever is selfish. I'm likely to assume they do have good intentions and not just a bitch, and therefore more likely to actually try and talk to them and understand what their wants are. Thirdly, we think that it means that people just think twice before they go on the path of least resistance. And this is the most important thing. Then all the pressures I described aren't disappearing, right? You still have reasons to be selfish. You still have the tendency to understand yourself better. But when we give a counter narrative that allows you to also think of the other side, you think twice. You make a rational case-by-case decision. You have the initial urge to be selfish on both sides. On our side, you also have the narrative that tells you, wait, think back, try to understand the other side of it, and decide if in this particular instance, it's right to be selfish or not. This is where we are likely to achieve balance. Before I move on to the second point, I'd like to take OG.
Yeah, but when you require someone to step in and say, think about me, or what does this other person want, that is a reinsertion of the self, not an erosion of the self. You don't get that unless there is a norm of selfishness and prioritization of the self.
We do have a norm of selfishness under our side of the debate. I'm not sure if I understood the POI, honestly. I'm going to get to the second point because it sounds to me like it gets to the point about women and stuff like that. So let's argue on the breaking of asymmetry. Something that is important to mention here. Patriarchy exists on both sides. Women being expected to make sacrifices in their life and to prioritize men to an extent exists on both sides. The question is, where do we have it a bit better in terms of balance, and where do we balance this off better? 3 metrics for why we think our narrative is better for women. Firstly, in terms of empathy, note how most of the things I argued in my first point are more applicable to men than they are to women. The reason for this is that we constantly hear on the male perspective all the time. They are the protagonists in most those stories. They are the ones who write the news. We know the male experience, so it's easier for women to empathize with them. Men don't hear about women experience on the day-to-day because we're never prioritized in the media. They need to actively try and think and search for it in order to empathize with women because they are not exposed to it on the day-to-day. Secondly, power. Most decisions in the household are unfortunately made by men because they are the breadwinner, because they are the ones socialized to be more assertive. It means that even if women were selfish, they have very limited choice and power in actually making this selfishness pay off for them, right? They don't make most household decisions. Whereas men today, who on both sides make the decisions, on government side will make the decisions only in their own incentives. On our side, they at least try and think what is beneficial also for their spouses, their daughters, their whatever, because we think that this means that under our side, they still maybe still have the power, but at least they try to make this power pay off for everyone. Lastly, susceptibility. We think that on both sides, the narrative is likely to revolve greatly around men, as most narratives are. What do we mean by this? When we talk about narratives, it's not just a general thing. We usually see it in movies, we see it in stories, we see it in things that our parents tell us. This is usually told from the perspective of men because they are the protagonists in most of these things, meaning that we are more likely to see selflessness on our side as men sacrificing things for their spouses because they are usually the protagonist of the story. Under their side, selfishness is also likely to be portrayed from the perspective of men, only emphasizing the asymmetry. Beg you to oppose.
Thank you. We now welcome the government whip.
POIs in the chat. Three, two, one. I think being selfish required the manifestation of your thoughts or manifestations of your actions, which is the solution to the problem which Hadar and Xiao-ke trying to point out as closing opposition, right? Because Hadar is like, closing government never proved the premise that people are good in identifying the trade-offs, but they are comparatively better in identifying the trade-offs which they understand from their own perspective, which are directly connected to their actions, and which they are which they can control comparatively more than their partners. That they can control the external circumstances, which control the other people's decision-making process and the potential hurt which might came to their mindset. And if the problem on the close that now we hear only male perspective about the empathy and the other things. We need people to talk more in the relationships. We need them to emphasize what they actually want and not assert that they need to be silenced and follow the person who is taking a lead and who is more capable to express their selflessness or selfishness and their own priorities. I wanted to talk about a couple of things in this speech, but firstly, I wanted to justify the metric in this debate because I think the opening opposition metric about the long-term benefits are defeated by Lucia in her speech when she said that it's really difficult to predict what will happen in the future. Exactly. If you are expecting the benefits to come after your immediate sacrifice, you might have massive disappointment. I have at least 5 reasons why the long-term metrics is unjustified in this debate to require the benefits. The first one is I think about the calculus being likely to change based on the financial reasons, right? Based on the capitalist framework, which every single team agreed in this debate, if you're losing money, if you are having unstable financial situations, you probably prioritize yourself or like you are making less rational decision good for the relationships because you need to survive based on the instinct and based on the requirements of the life. Second of all, your preferences might change over time because you get more information, because your choices expanding when you are older, because you have much more prosperity. Third, you might just feel in better vibe, better chemistry, or better emotions towards the other person. Fourthly, the sickness tragedy, the limitation to your body, or fifthly, the other relations which make you sad, like some sort of disappointment that you are less likely to enter the other relationships. All of that means that the benefits from opening opposition are largely speculative because you can't control if the other person decide to not pay you back your selflessness or they decide to prioritize themselves because their conditions changed, which means that you might lost yourself, you might be selfless towards the other person and never get this paid back, which means that your transaction is giving up to the other person and never getting paid for your labor. This is extremely speculative on-site opening opposition, which means that their benefits are not sticking in the debate. But second of all, I think follow up to my POI. If this person will be good towards yourself, if they understand you, they are probably have good moral high ground, and they will not become the malicious only because of this narrative, which means that a lot of the characterization and benefits from opening opposition functioning on both sides of the debate, probably on the smaller marginal spectrum, which was never weighted up or explained why they are making such a crucial difference, right? So I wanted to also talk about the other things in this speech. So Lucia said that everyone in the work demands your best, like the capitalism and everything, the university. But now you're shifting your partner also demanding the best from you if you are selfless, right? Because you internalizing this and you are basing on the perception of the person in this relationship because you think that this is the more important thing than what you are doing. And here is how Sharmila extension playing out in this debate, right? Which was completely unresponded by Hadar. I think assuming the larger value to justify the particular actions happen much earlier than you internalizing the norms coming externally from the patriarchy and from the other things. From the very young years, when you are hearing the stories, when you are watching the movies, when your parents talking to you, you are like, this is probably something more important than the other things and people giving that the special value. But you never exercise the special value because you can't be fully yourself in this, because you feel that to make that function in the practical life, you need to fit to the paradigm and you need to fit to the framework which opening opposition already provided, which means that what Sherry also responded and engaged in this, it's about making people sad and taking away your capacity to fully enjoy it and to fully being involved in this particular thing. And I think the second follow-up to this, it's how that's play out later in the sustainability of this relation in terms of people being risk averse and in terms of people having particular limitations. So here is the bottom line of our extension and solvency to the problems pointed out by opt-ins. We believe that if people are encouraged to be selfish, and if this is becoming the better norm, people talking more about that because they need to express their selfish preference, they will probably compromise in the end because the partner also wants the best, right? Because there are other coexisting narratives which opening opposition and closing opposition concede. So probably you will have much more information how to assess this and how to deal with that in the long term, and therefore the sustainability and potential benefits calculus will increase, not when you are counting on that without changing. Opening opposition now.
So your case is premised on us being able to better understand that framework. The problem is that framework doesn't neatly apply to relationships. A relationship is not employment. Our benefits are, yes, more speculative, but it's exceedingly rare that you never, ever get any payoff down the track. And importantly, our case is not premised on that.
No.
We talk about things like women.
No, if your POI, it's true. Your case, it's premise. People are separating the spheres of their life. Here is how I'm perceiving emotions. Here are I perceiving the other things. That doesn't work that way. In theory, maybe, but by the practical outcomes, by the hardships which you have, and how everything is connected, it's hard to make that in the books, right? So I think in the end of the debate, I think there are two important things. About the women's situation, about the genders, and about the men inequality. I think it's a large wash. I'm unclear if opening opposition or opening government when this clash, because I think the change is dependent on how the people function inside and how people internalize these relations, which I think we told you how this is actually happening and how this came to people. Second of all, I think we justify to you why we should prioritize the sustainability and how people are starting these relationships and not what they are expecting later, because it's hard to assess. I think in the end, on site op, there are people who are losing out without getting something back, which is a massive harm, and therefore we propose.
Thank you. We now welcome the opposition with.
I'd like for people to give me POIs just by turning on their video and waving. I don't look at the chat. If you want, you can also just unmute yourself and say POI. Judge, this debate may have been somewhat frustrating to judge because I genuinely think that in some ways it was slightly parallel, i.e. Top Boss is very, very definitely a war of characterization, right? Like Uji was like, selflessness is this tool of patriarchy which is used to oppress women. And OO was like, on the other hand, I think selflessness is great, right? When you help your friends, doesn't that feel good? And very, very little crossing the floor. I think that's why Hadar really, really wins this debate, because she's the first one to really dive into the nitty-gritty and explain, here's how this narrative actually interacts with base human instincts to correct failures in our behaviors and our ability to understand other people in the counterfactual. The human default is incredibly self-contained. IDK, me, I'm just a psychopath, but, I genuinely believe in the thing about how, I don't know whether other people exist. I'm only aware of my own needs and wants. For all you know, the color that you see might be a different color green to me, and therefore it's very, very easy to forget that everyone else has as complex and rich an inner life as I do. And therefore, this narrative of selfishness is incredibly, incredibly bad because it just really encourages people to double down on this feeling that I'm the center of this universe and everyone around me are tools and utility devices and ends to my own happiness and satisfaction. CG has a little bit of pushback to this, where they say, but from a little child, we're raised up to watch various movies when the girl sacrifices herself, blah, 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 blah. Like, honestly, just really, really intuitively, not gonna lie, I think this might apply slightly more to men in pop culture, but the much, much better and more genuine reply is just, what's a bigger influence on your decision making, norms or biology? I would say biology, just because even if you have a big idea that this is what I should do from TV shows, I don't feel an actual sense of pain or dissatisfaction or physical discomfort when I do something that makes me less happy. On the other hand, doing selfless things such as working extra shifts at the hospital in order to feed my children does have a huge amount of discomfort, and therefore it's so much more important that we correct this far superior force. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take out CG and OO really quickly before going absolutely ham on OG. So CG's idea was just this idea about how relationships are more successful. Very glibly, I just think that, to be honest, their mech on communication is kind of non-unique, just because, not gonna lie, I think in the day-to-day, everyone knows that communication is a necessary prerequisite towards good and healthy relationships, just because regardless of whether or not we're selfish or selfless, Srishti, I'll take you later, it's important to talk to each other in order to have relationships function, right? We're defending the status quo here. Remember, Judge, that this is not a debate about a world where everyone is absolutely selfish versus a world where everyone is absolutely selfless and bumbles around making assumptions about what the other person wants. But second of all, I would actually say that on our side, we actually have way more communication, because when you're selfless and prioritize making sure the other person benefits just as much as you do, that's the point at which you reach out and communicate and check on them more. But finally, I just want to deal with CG's best case scenario, where you do have this communication and perhaps you have a better understanding of what each other needs. I don't think that this leads to a sustainable relationship, though, just because I think that does lead to resentment, where your selfish view is I want to milk and squeeze as much out of the other person as possible, and you get tired of the other person asking you for things. Okay, that's CG out. Let's talk about OO then. I think to be just the OO case is very, very pretty, can be condensed into this nice little chunk of analysis that just says, look, selflessness is nice, and selflessness is bad. Okay, so basically that was really, really glib. I just don't have the notes down to have every single line of analysis down. But TLDR, here's why Hadar beats them. Because I think that the analysis coming from OO is generally mostly descriptive, and there's not much analysis about why it is that this changes on their side, right? Because the problem of their analysis that they assume that people are able to act perfect, that people move from perfectly selfless to perfectly selfish doesn't work for the reason that Gov points out, right? Which is the Gov response is, but obviously I won't be a dick to everyone because I still want to be nice to everyone for the very simple reason that it feels good to me, right? So therefore, it's still transactional in that way, but I'm still nice to people. The reason why Hadar's analysis actually breaks this deadlock and therefore rescues the OO case is because she's the person who brings in the idea of the prisoner's dilemma, i.e., even it's not the case that every single person in the world transitions from suddenly I'm going to from dog eat dog to nice to everyone, but the reason why we get there is because we're risk averse and we're afraid that the other person is going to shaft you, and therefore because you have the worst possible ideas of everyone else, because we understand that everyone in relationships are out to get each other, that therefore I should default to assume the other person is out to get me and I should break these promises first. Okay, now an OG. So first I'm going to respond to Srishti's really, really big brain POI, which is the idea of the reassertion of self, right? I want to just say this sounds really, really cool, but I want to say that it's just not true that their core premise that in the absence of this narrative of selfishness, that there's no sense of self exists, very simply because people come in and out of our life and they're transitional, right? They move in and they move out. At no point do we lose our sense of identity just because when we go to sleep at night, the only person whose thoughts we're hearing and sharing are our own. So for those reasons, I think we very, very much are in tune with our own feelings to an extent that we can't have on their side. Sorry, I might run out of time. I'm sorry. Cool. But to let's look at their core case, right? Which is that OG says that, look, there's an imbalance in relationships, especially between men and women, and that we're able to correct this. The key problem is that there's a massive, massive leap between pointing out there's an imbalance and assuming that selfishness can correct that, because that presupposes that when women try to be selfish, that they're actually going to get what they want. The problem with this is that the underlying reason between abusive and manipulative relationships is not one person is selfish and the other person isn't, but rather there is this very, very simple power asymmetry. For example, there's an asymmetry in towards I'm emotionally dedicated to my partner, which means that they can spend no time with me, but I'm still in love with them, so I just stay with them for the sake of it, right? Or alternatively, in their case of men and women, regardless of how much the woman is asking for, if the man still has the house, she's still fucked, right? So for those reasons, in a world where we have a lot of selfishness, actually inequalities get much, much, much worse. The reason for this is because selfishness is necessary to hedge against power asymmetries, because that's the point at which they understand, even though I have the ability to technically take everything you have and keep you there, I'm not going to, because I understand in a relationship, I'm supposed to be giving to you and equalizing things. So for those reasons, I think we actually correct for the OG case much, much better. But the second reason why you should vote for us over OG is very simply because their harms are the harms they say it is, right? That adult children are fucked because they have to take care of their parents. I'm sorry, but adult children sacrificing to take care of their elderly parents are really, really important and great. And the reason for this is because narratives about selflessness often intersect with who has more power and more strength in a relationship. If you have more ability, you should then care about them more. Finally, on Enting spike about how it's impossible to leave relationships, I genuinely think, just gut check this. We understood that this is a harm without hurting to explain, because toxic relationships are a thing in the status quo. When relationships are hurting you more than it does anything else, I think biological instincts kick in and you choose to leave, and very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, everyone, for fantastic debate. So can I just get 5 minutes to summarize my notes and then we can go back live? Is that okay?
That's no problem.
Srishti's like, no.
Good debate, friends. That was very fun.
Are we good?
Yeah, just going live. I'm sorry, this just takes
No
like a few
worries,
seconds.
no worries, no worries. Yeah, me too. To Srishti. Okay. Cool. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think we're good.
Just a second, we're not live yet. Yeah, I think we're live now.
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
Okay, great, brilliant.
Great. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for the fantastic debate. So my role here is actually to be a bit more of like a commentator / coach, and to use this debate where we've had excellent speeches to unpack the good strategies that teams and speakers used, and perhaps to point to some areas where there could have been a bit more improvement, but overall to really use this excellent debate as a model to teach how people can debate better. So to kind of unpack these strategies that teams used, right? Now, the motion in front of us, so this house prefers a world where people conceived of relationships as selfish, is a really tricky and complicated motion. It's not easy to do. And I think the teams here did a very good job of handling this motion. So what's incredibly important with a motion like this, so the first step, right, for all the teams in the debate is to have a clear characterization of the two worlds that they are comparing. And if you notice, all teams began their case by, staking their claim on what this world looks like and by characterizing what the world looks like, right? And what does this mean, actually? So this means like conceptualizing the preferred world, so the imagined world where relationships are driven by selfishness, but also conceptualizing what the current world looks like in order to set the stage for that comparison. And in conceptualizing the current world, obviously teams that will be ahead here are the teams that are characterizing it in the most realistic way possible. So in a way that doesn't just preference examples that are convenient for their side or the worst case of the other side, right? And in a way that is rigorous. And we think all teams played ball here. So teams weren't just, carving out a narrow set of cases and choosing to debate those cases. Like everyone here was willing to debate the middle range case, which is a sign of a good debate, right? So you need to be willing to debate even examples that aren't very convenient for you. So there is, of course, a difference in how teams characterized what the world looks like now and what this world looks like in the future if we have this preferred world, but they have been interacting with each other. So what opening government does, and does quite well, is actually talk to us about how in the world now there are uneven expectations of selflessness, and that we do have a mixture already of selflessness and selfishness. But in terms of people's entitlements and in terms of what's expected of people, there are particular hierarchies that operate, and they paid a lot of attention to gender hierarchies, which throughout the end of the debate actually did stick, right? The other mechanism that opening government introduced here was to say that the way this norm operates is not simply that it is externally imposed, but also that it becomes internalized through the language of guilt, through how people's notion of happiness is shaped, through how their preferences are constructed, which don't happen in a neutral way. These happen in a very gendered way, right? And so what they then want is a world where selfishness is explicit and normalized for everyone, where people can, according to them, still feel some love and care, but prioritize self-interest in their interactions. So opening up accepts some of this characterization, but also reframes some of it and says, look, in terms of how the world looks like now, again, which is quite reasonable, they say, look, there is some space for pushing back against these gendered expectations already. Yes, we accept there is some disparity in how this norm is applied, but it is getting better. And they give us some intuitive examples of what that looks like, right? And they also talk to us about how individuals already exist in a very dehumanizing world, where there are a lot of other things that they have to fulfill, a lot of other roles they have to fulfill for economic survival, such that relationships are sort of like a sanctuary, right? Like a zone where you are able to relax and perhaps not have to always be on your best behavior. And so for them, this new world that the proposition side is proposing becomes a world where no one is actually willing to sacrifice anymore, and a world where relationships become quite stressful and quite transactional. And both opposition teams agree that there are disparities in how selflessness plays out at the moment, but they argue that these existing asymmetries, the patriarchy, is not become exacerbated in a world where selfishness is just accepted and normalized, right? Closing Gov doubles down on the characterization of transactional relationships, which OG was kind of trying to at least rhetorically avoid. But Closing Gov is like, nah, we're biting that bullet, which I appreciate. And they were like, no, yes, our model is what happens in the workplace. And they flip that characterization of opening up on its head, like rhetorically, and are like, no, actually, in the workplace, your boundaries are clear. In the workplace, you are more intentional and deliberate about what your interests are. We would like to apply that model to relationships, and we actually think it will be better. So this is where teams stand, right? And how much they're willing to accept of what their new world looks like. Now, very briefly, in terms of the arguments that were made here, and I thought what arguments were done really well and what arguments perhaps could have been pushed or leveraged further. I think Opening Gov here does a really good job, and I think this is something that we should pay attention to in terms of debates on norms. A lot of these things happen in some cases on the margins. A lot of these changes that you're going to be enacting are incremental, and they do a good job of illustrating that granularity in their case. So when they talk about how conceptions of happiness are quite gendered and provide pretty intuitive examples of what certain actors are expected to give up as a result and are told will make them happy, such that, you know, indicating otherwise makes them bad, makes them, you know, not virtuous. And there's a lot of discussion of how the expected effects are that negotiations in relationships become more intentional, people think more carefully about their own interests, and they are more conscious in their understanding of what they give and take, and people will be more willing to respect boundaries. There's also a discussion of like how a lot of these costs that are borne by women are incremental and cumulative, so they don't happen in one fell swoop, right? But then they create some degree of path dependency, because if you've given up enough, this forecloses future options for you, and it becomes easier to walk away from abusive relationships or reject unfair demands if you are thinking of yourself too. I think these characterizations are very well done. Where the opposition side pushed OG on, and where OG perhaps could have been a bit clearer, is just that slight extra step of, are these negotiations going to play out in the way OG does suggest, right? Given the already patriarchal context that exists, are people capable of applying, in a really good POI from Jess, this type of objectivity when it comes to relationships that they are able to apply in the workplace setting? And this is kind of where CG positions themselves and says, yes, they absolutely can. But there is a lot of preemptive material in OG that suggests that once you address, you know, the structural configuration of these things, in the long term, you do change the way relationships play out, and you do change the way people communicate with each other, which perhaps Off-Bench could have been more charitable about as well when explaining how the negotiations play out. So Opening Up, I think, does a very good job of appealing to intuition here and common sense and reasonableness by saying, look, there is space for a more gender equal conception of relationships, even in a world where we value and idealize selflessness. And I would have wanted to hear like more storification of this and more time on this to show that this is indeed actually changing. And there are other drivers for changing this that don't have to involve, you know, throwing out selflessness necessarily. The characterization as well of how, you know, relationships do require people to be willing to give up certain things at certain points without a clear assurance that it is in their interest, because otherwise relationships are simply not going to function, because you don't have, you know, complete information for parity at that moment, is quite promising. CO does a lot with this when they explicitly, you know, model a prisoner's dilemma in relationships, and how people don't have access to perfect information, and how people are unable to to predict the future, and therefore you must just like force them to err on the side of selflessness. So CO does capitalize on that, although the seeds of that, right, like the framework for that does come out in Opening Up quite well. The other two things Opening Up does well are, one, to show that, you know, selflessness does generally pay off. Although I would have wanted to see more of a comparison with OG saying it doesn't. Sometimes you're actually quite miserable in the end, but you weren't able to see that from the start, right? But OO goes, no, sometimes it does pay off, but you need to be incentivized in that direction. Otherwise, you'd never have done it because of the immediate gratification that exists. So CO does put in a lot of work to cement that link. The other thing Opening Up does well is to explain a counter narrative, so a compelling description of how the patriarchy actually plays out here, by saying, no, actually what happens is men feel even more justified in extracting labor and extracting a return on investment from women as a result of this. Now, how this argument could have been strengthened, as pointed out by both Closing Gov and a POI from Opening Gov, is that it needed to be made in a way that was responsive to the argument from the prop side that women, though, will become more aware of their self-interest and more willing to assert it. So that probably would have made that argument, would have won that argument over Opening Gov if it was made in a more comparative way. So closing teams did a very good job of positioning themselves to fill the gaps in analysis of the opening team. So as I said, Closing Gov correctly identified that they had to double down here and defend the feasibility of a transactional model even in relationships, and to defend why in the long term it actually pays off. What I would have wanted to see a bit more from Closing Gov is a response to the prisoner's dilemma discussion of closing up, of how perhaps in some situations we do have to rely on selflessness despite the asymmetries that exist for relationships to actually be feasible or sustainable in the first place. I think Closing Up does two things well. One is to, position themselves as like people breaking the deadlock in a really messy characterization battle, which is always, a strategic thing to do, and to suggest that actually kind of double down and say, actually, no, there are enough natural incentives that exist towards selfishness by virtue of the fact that your knowledge is limited and therefore you think you are correct, by virtue of the fact that you feel more enjoyment when you do selfish things and more pain when you do selfless things, with a bit in tension with some of the material that's going out in the debate, but fair enough, like they're allowed this characterization, right? And so they're like, look, the impulse to be selfish already exists, so what we need is a counterbalance for that. What I do think Closing Up could do a bit better is more sensitivity and attention to the characterization on prop side of how this is still gendered, because the expression of selfishness still has more costs for certain people than others, such that women do feel pain or more pain, or are made to feel more pain if they act on this selfishness impulse, which is something I think that OG did put on the table quite persuasively. The discussion, though, on how it leads people to be inherently cynical about relationships and leads to like beggar thy neighbor behavior in relationships, which ultimately like becomes very, very dangerous for relationships in the future, I think is quite powerful. And I do think perhaps more investment could have gone into this argument in terms of storyfying it and illustrating it concretely. All right, so thanks very much to the teams. As you can see, I was generally blown away by this debate, but I hope you've also found some of that unpacking helpful in terms of thinking about debate more strategically, especially narrative debates. Thanks, everyone. I also need to run to a work meeting now. So goodbye.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sharmila. And thank you all for joining, and everyone who's watching. We're just going to go off now. Bye.
Thank you.